RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. It has been quite some time since I posted anything here on YouTube. I've been quite busy. I finished up that walnut sideboard that I was working on in a bunch of my previous videos. You've probably seen it, and delivered it to the client, and then it was off to Switzerland where my wife had an extended work trip, and rather than separate the family, we decided to just tag along with her. So we hung out in Switzerland, hung out with my kid, did a bunch of bird photography. It was fantastic. And then when I got back, I redid our screen porch, and then I had to catch up with our summer garden, and then I started our fall garden. So it's been busy around here, but now I am back and ready to do the next project. So before my hiatus, I had received a number of requests to do more build-oriented videos where I kind of do a project from start to finish. And one of those build-oriented videos that I had kind of promised I would do is a smaller project, and this is that smaller project. It's this guy right here. So this is what I call a wine caddy, and this is something that I designed many years ago when I was in a different shop that had hardly any electricity at all. So this is a project that you can do with minimal power tools. If there's a couple I would say that are pretty key to this, it would be like a cordless drill with a dowel jig would be great, and a drill press. Outside of that, you can do this, I think, entirely with hand tools. And there's even a little bit of leather working involved as well. So before we get started, I think it makes sense to kind of take a closer look at this design and kind of deconstruct it a little bit. It's been a long time since I built one of these, and it might require a little bit of reverse engineering to kind of see what you would be in for should you choose to build one of these along with me. So let's take a closer look. All right, so here is the wine caddy design, and let's start taking it apart and taking a look at it. So this is designed to hold any Bordeaux style wine bottle, which is the most common style of wine bottle that there is out there in the world. And it's meant to kind of give you a secure way to carry it and keep it from getting bumped, and to display the bottle, because one of my favorite things about wine bottles is the artwork on the labels. I just love that about it. This actually isn't a Bordeaux bottle. This is just in here to kind of show you what it looks like with the bottle in it. But you can see that I can lift the top off of here, and the top is tethered to the main handle with a leather strap, and then it just rotates back. Inside the top there, hopefully you can see that, there's a little hole drilled that the top of the bottle will fit into when it's lowered onto the case. And that helps keep the bottle that's in there centered and from rattling around too much when you're swinging around your wine caddy. On the front here, we have a kind of a narrow piece of wood. It has a little bit of an arch cut into it, and that's secured to the sides with this simple butt joint. So it's just glued and then nailed with these copper nails. I'm a big fan of copper, so everything here is copper, but you could theoretically do this in brass or, alloy or whatever, if you prefer a different color. And then at the bottom here is kind of the same thing, but a little bit wider. Having this piece of wood here be a wider, or I guess taller in this case, piece than this one, kind of gives it a grounded look when you set it down. And then between the two, I have them kind of connected by these little 1/4-inch copper pieces of tubing. And in order to drill these holes in either end, I used a dowel jig, and not only for the sake of drilling perfectly straight into these little pieces of wood, but also to get them positioned exactly the same top and bottom. And then there's a kind of a reverse arch in the bottom there. So that's what kind of gives you that nice window to the front of the bottle and helps showcase the artwork on the front of the bottle. At the bottom here, I have a piece that's attached with dovetails. This is probably the trickiest part of this project if you're a little bit newer to woodworking, but I will walk you through it. I thought it important to do dovetails at the bottom so that when you're walking across somebody's driveway on the way to their house to give them a bottle of wine, that the bottom doesn't fall out and your bottle along with it, smashing on the driveway with a bunch of glass and spilled wine. I thought that was probably the most secure way to put the bottom on this design. And then there's just a couple of little adhesive backed cork feet. And I don't know why these are off center here. That's kind of weird. But that just gives it a soft place to land and make it less likely to scratch a countertop when you set it down. And then at the very top here, I have my Mountaintop Joiner Shop kind of maker's badge. That's a good place for that if you have that kind of thing. And it's the same on the back as it is on the front, not only for the sake of symmetry, but also to simplify the build and perhaps display the back of the bottle too, if somebody wants to take a look at that without popping it out of the caddy. So that's the Caddy in a nutshell. And again, if you're doing this along with me and you're doing it mostly with hand tools like I'm going to be demonstrating, you'll want to use a hand tool friendly wood. And I've made these in all kinds of woods before. This one's just pine from the home center. I think they call it radiata pine. I don't even know if that's really a thing, but it was very easy to work with. And of course I've done it with cherry. And I think in this video I'm going to be doing it with walnut because I have a person in mind that I'd like to gift this to when it's all said and done. And I know that person likes walnut, so I think that's what I'll do in this video. So I'm going to go over to the lumber rack, see what I have over there, and pick out a piece of wood to make this from. Okay, so now I'm over at a part of the shop you don't normally see, and that's where my lumber rack is. And if you're curious about my lumber rack and the way that things are vertically oriented with the boards kind of stashed in here like books would be, I talk about that in my shop tour video. So throughout this series, I'm going to be referring to other videos I've done that cover a given subject in much more depth than I'm going to be covering it in this video because this is more of a build video. So be ready for that. So shop tour if you want to know about this lumber rack. But what I'm looking for here in the board, I took the measurements off of the Caddy, and that is about 4.5 inches wide and about 50 inches long. When I designed it in imperial. So this series is going to be in imperial, but wherever possible, I'm going to put up the metric equivalent as well. So when I look through the boards that I have here in walnut, a lot of them are either too thick and require too much milling, and it's kind of a waste of wood that way, or they're not wide enough or too wide, and that's often the case when you go to your lumber rack looking for a particular board. But the one I have my eye on is this one right here. This one is a 4/4 board, which means that it is before milling about 1 inch thick, and after milling it usually ends up being about 3/4 of an inch thick. So the thickest piece of this project is the little piece that fits under the top with the hole in it that fits over the cap of the bottle. That part is about 3/4 of an inch. The rest of the project is going to be basically 1/2 inch material. So there's going to be some milling to be done here. But if you use two different boards, you can use one that's a 1/2 inch thick board and another one that's a 3/4 inch board and save yourself some milling. But I'm going to try to get all of it out of this one board. That way all the pieces of the project match each other because they're all from the same board. Let me fish it out of here and we'll take a look at it. This one, you know, for walnut, this isn't too bad. You know, walnut's a pretty gnarly tree and it tends to beget gnarly boards with gnarly grain that reverses and is a big pain in the butt. But this one is pretty straight grain and pretty clear. There's not a lot of knots in it either. There's kind of a big knot up here and one down here. And because this is double the width that I need, remember I was needing about 4.5 inches. This is about 10 inches wide. So I should be able to get what I need off of each edge of this board and not need that full 50 inches of length, you know, closer to half of that. So I think I can get what I need avoiding these big knots altogether, and maybe even this little one right here. I might be able to work from either side of that. So I think this is the way to go. It's not too twisted up or anything like that. It's not a potato chip. So I think it'll be relatively easy to mill and get what I need out of it. So let's take it over to the bench. We'll mark it up and start sawing. So now I have this board over at my bench, and as I alluded to earlier, I think I'm going to be taking all of my stock off of from each edge of the board. So that'll help me do a couple of things. It's just going to help me avoid some of these knots a little bit. Like if I take a strip off of this edge, I can use the full length of the board and give myself some extra stock that I may or may not need later. If I goof up, I can get an extra part off of this. Another thing it does is avoid the pith of the board. So this board is such that the growth rings are a little bit of a tight loop right here of a circle, and that part of the board is going to expand and contract a lot, whereas all the growth rings at the edge of the board kind of go through the board, the thickness of the board at like a 45-degree angle, which is what we would call rifts on. And as such, that's less liable to expand and contract a lot across the width of the board. So theoretically, a strip off of this side and this side, removing that little curve in the middle, will be more stable and won't move as much once it's milled and, of course, once it's glued up. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So in order to get that started, I need a smooth reference point from which to work. So the edges of this board are pretty straight. They're just a little bit rough from where they were sawn originally, especially this side. This is pretty rough sawn. So I need to smooth this down and make sure it's a straight line with my joiner plane first. So this might be a little bit of a departure from tradition, but what I'm doing here is informed by tradition. I'm not a slave to tradition. I'm just going to do what makes sense to me, and hopefully it makes sense to you as well. And we'll just take it from there. So let me chuck this up in the bench here and plane the edges of it nice and straight. And then I'll be able to use those edges as reference edges from which to mark in from the edge of the board about 4.5 or maybe a little bit more than that. Leave myself some room. And then I can do my rip cuts. All right, so let's put this in the bench. Got my sliding dead man on one end with a dog stop in it. And a leg vise on the other. By the way, if you're curious about this bench, I did a video about this bench. So I'll put a reference to that in the show description. And I'm gonna plane this edge nice and straight and smooth. It's pretty straight already. There's a little bit of a hump right about here. And it appears I'm going with the grain here, but you never know until you take a pass usually. So let's just see what happens. Got my joiner plane set up. Not bad. And I'm not too concerned about whether it's very square or not this way. As long as it's not just way out of square, I'm not too worried. My main concern at this point is just to make sure that it's smooth and a straight line from end to end. So that little bit of a hump that was there, need to make sure that that goes away. And that's actually pretty close already. So I'm going to take a nice light shaving just to knock down any high spots there are along the length. So I know that if I'm taking a very thin shaving coupled with a very long length of the plane sole on a joiner plane, that any high spots I'm going to be planing off, and any low spots the blade might not even be cutting. So I'll know that I'm very close to a very straight board end to end if, when I take a very thin shaving, I'm taking a shaving from one end all the way to the other, and there's no spot along the course of that pass where I'm not taking a shaving. I hope that makes sense. So on that pass, I'm taking a pretty even thickness shaving, full length of the board. So I know I'm doing pretty well from a straightness standpoint now. And I'll just double check really quick to make sure I'm not, wildly out of square. Actually, it's almost perfectly dead square all along the length of this, just a little high along this right side edge, which I'll hit really quick, and I think that'll do it for that edge. I'm going to flip it around the other side. This side is much more rough sawn, so I'm going to have to start out taking a pretty thick shaving just to get it smooth enough to work with. And I can just tell that like the sole of my plane is actually rocking on this spot right here. I can feel it. So I didn't even really need my straight edge to know that there was a little bit of a hill right here. So I'm going to concentrate on that part of the board for a moment. Looks like I've knocked that high spot off. This whole edge here is quite high. I'd like it to be a little more square than that. So I'm going to shift my plane blade over a little bit so I'm taking a little bit deeper cut on that edge. And also apply a little bit of body English to that side as well. And a little bit thinner shaving. And keep removing material because there's still a low spot here that's very rough. There we go. Pretty close to square there. Smoothing that spot out a little more. There we go. A little high along this far edge here. So I'm going to concentrate on that. And then I'm going to start taking thinner shavings, which will not only knock down increasingly more subtle high spots, but also leave a little bit smoother surface from which to reference off of when I mark the width of the rip cut I'm about to do. So a straight edge obviously is nice to have. Of course you can use, a ruler or something like that too, but this one is a pretty accurate one from Veritas that I like to keep around. There we go, that's close enough. Let me make some room here, get some shavings out of the way. Put this on my bench. And I'm going to use what's called a panel gauge to mark the line that I want to do my rip cut on. And when I do that, I like to put some dog stops in the dog holes in my bench, just to keep the board from moving as much when I move my panel gauge along the surface. And the reason I'm doing these rip cuts before I do any milling is because a smaller board is much easier to mill flat, especially by hand, than one that is really big and wide. So I'm doing a lot of my cuts to rough length before I actually do any of the milling. All right, so check out this contraption. So this thing is a panel gauge, and this one I made myself, so it's kind of fancy pants. Basically what you have is a big long rod or a piece of wood. You have a fence attached to that is movable, so I can slide this from end to end. And in one end of it, I have clamped a pencil that's, somewhat sharp. I don't want this razor sharp because this is just a rough cut anyways. And so actually having a thicker pencil line on this dark colored walnut will be easier to see. So I didn't, go crazy sharp, but I sharpened it a little bit. And then I'm just going to move the fence of this panel gauge along here until I'm at about a little over 4.5 inches, maybe 4 5/8. Oops, actually my fence is right here. It's right about there. So I'm going to tighten that down in that spot. Make sure it's good and tight right there. This little knurled brass nut. By the way, if you don't want to make one of these, which I wouldn't blame you if you were new to woodworking, it might be a little intimidating at first, you can actually buy panel gauges like this. I know back in the day Lee Nielsen made one. They probably still do. And I wouldn't be surprised if Veritas has their own version now too. I think Woodpeckers makes one. So you don't have to make one of these if you don't want to. But they are handy to have, especially if you're doing a lot of hand tool work. So that's at about 4 5/8, and I'm just going to put this little part of the fence right here, this little lip, this little rabbit, right along this edge, and just drag it along. So I'm going to hold it square to the board just like that, and drag it along. And I keep going back and forth because I want the pencil line to be easy to see, so just doing it just like that. I think I might have just knocked the pencil head off on that knot. That'll happen. It's okay though. And I'm going to flip this around and take another line reference from the opposite edge here. And so what this panel gauge is doing in effect is drawing a line parallel to this edge the full length of the board. Just like that. I think you got the idea. That's the use of the panel gauge to mark where my rip cuts are going to go. And so I'm going to put my panel gauge away in the tool chest, which, the beam just slides off the end. Hopefully whatever design you pick up will allow you to do that. It just makes it easier to tuck it away somewhere where it's not in the way. And I'll show you what saw you should use for doing these rip cuts. So you want to get a panel saw like this, not a saw with a back on it. And it'll be nice and long. I think this one's like a 26-inch long saw plate. This one's by Pax Saws, and I think I got it from Lee Valley, actually. And it's a rip panel saw. So it's got very few teeth per inch. I don't know if it'll focus that close, but these teeth, pretty big. And that's the kind of saw you want to use for doing your rip cuts. Really aggressive saw teeth with big gullets in between them. And each of these teeth are filed straight across the saw plate such that each of these teeth is basically like a miniature chisel. So that's the kind of saw you'll want to use. Now, if you get a pack saw, it's not going to look like this. This one has my own saw tote on it. That's what we call the handle on a panel saw like this, the tote. And I made this tote to have a very aggressive hang angle on it, which is the angle at which the handle directs the force of your hand pushing towards the teeth. So for me, the hang angle is kind of back towards the heel of the saw plate a little bit more than the standard tote might be. The totes that come on these are super basic and not super comfortable, so I ended up making new saw totes for all of my panel saws. And I haven't used this thing in a really long time because I have a bandsaw now. So this ought to be interesting. We'll see if I can still cut straight with one of these and how long it takes. All right, so this is my saw bench, and my saw bench has this funky L shape to it, and this is just an experiment of mine that I built quite a while back, and I really, really like it. So if you're wondering what the deal with this weird L-shaped saw bench is, I'll go and check out that video. I've done one about it, and I'll leave a link in the description. And so here's my board. I got my lines marked on it. You can see, well, hopefully you can see it. I don't know if it shows up as well on camera as it does to me. I can see it fine, so that's the important thing. And I'm just going to put it on the edge of my saw bench such that the line is overhanging the edge here, so I don't cut into my saw bench. And looks like I have a dog hole here I can use with a regular holdfast. And perhaps for the other side, I'll just use an F-style clamp like this one. Now, again, traditionally, you would do it differently. You would probably just put your knee on it. But I have really bony knees, and it's so uncomfortable. I hate it. I've never been the kind of person to hold down my saw stock with my knees. It's not how I roll. So yeah, I just clamp it or use holdfast or whatever to hold my stock for me. And what I'm going to do is cut this line first and then do this one. That way I don't have to unclamp and reclamp my bench here. And the thing about sawing is in a way, it's much easier than people would have you believe, or easier than it looks. And in other ways, it's kind of harder. There's a lot of practice involved with cutting a perfectly straight line. But the good news here is I'm just doing a rough cut to width. It doesn't have to be a perfectly straight line. So even if I'm wavy gravy when I'm cutting the length of this line, it's not a big deal. And if you recall, I actually put my line about 1/8 of an inch extra width here. So even if I overcut my line a little bit, not the end of the world. I'm going to be planing that to the line later on. So really, all you really need to do is stand in such a way that you're able to drop your forearm straight up and down. So you don't want anything in the way of your elbow when you're doing this. Just kind of get your feet apart in line with your line here, such that I can drop my hand. Like I don't have a saw in my hand right now, but if I just drop my hand straight down in line with gravity from my shoulder, I'm dropping right into that line. So that's what you want to endeavor to do when you're doing your saw cut. And then it's just a matter at that point of applying a little bit of body English with your saw tote to kind of steer the line along. Now, if you go off a line with gravity, then it stands to reason that you're going to end up cutting out a square, either this way or this way. You can line up your dominant eye, which is my right eye in this case, and look right down the spine of the saw. In that sense, looking down the full length of the spine of the saw is like using like a rifle sight. So you want to sight down the back of the saw and then drop your hand in line with gravity, and that should help you get a pretty square cut. But then it's just a matter of practicing and doing a lot of it. And if you don't have a bandsaw, you're going to end up doing a lot of it. You're going to be rip cutting all the time. To get started, I'm just kind of moving my hand and slowly lowering the teeth right next to my line here. Like that. I don't start out by drawing the teeth back because these teeth are so huge, you're just going to jump off the edge of the board. So I kind of get the saw moving first and then allow it to touch the wood. And I'm just using my thumb here, my thumbnail, as a guide. Just a tiny bit of pressure against the thumbnail keeps my saw from going that way when I'm trying to get my saw cut started. And now that I have a little bit of a curve here, I can just employ those techniques I was just describing, sighting down the back of the saw and then dropping my forearm in line with gravity as much as possible and start sawing away. By the way, when you do that cut, you don't want to cut too much this way. You'll cut quite a bit faster when there's less wood for the teeth to move through. And the way to achieve that is to go a little bit more vertical. So it's something else to keep in mind when you're doing these rip cuts. And so you can see that if I'm sighting down the back of my saw and I'm dropping my hand in line with gravity as much as possible, that I don't actually have to employ a lot of twist to the saw toe in order to steer it. So far I haven't really had to do that at all. So as you get more comfortable with that motion and get more in line with gravity, you're not going to have to steer as much by twisting the saw. And that's a good thing, because when you have to steer a lot by twisting the saw, you end up with a wavy cut line that the saw plate is more liable to get kind of caught up on, hung up on. There's more friction there, things get hot, the wood expands, it starts to kind of grab the saw. It's not so great. So as you practice this, you'll get to the point where you don't have to steer much at all with the tote, and you're just going with the flow. Here's a little bit of a different angle where you can see the angle that I'm sawing from. I'm not going like this, because that gives a lot more wood for the teeth to pass through before they get out the back side of the board. Go a little more vertical, and your teeth are have such a geometry such that they can take more material off per pass at this angle. If things start to get squirrely on you and you notice that the board is, kind of pinching, the kerf is kind of pinching the saw, and that's giving a lot of friction, there's no shame in cheating a little bit and putting a little bit of wax on your saw plate. And that will help with the friction a little bit, save you a ton of physical effort, and hopefully allow you to get your cut a little more back on track. All right, so now my kerf is all the way back here, and you'll notice that there's a lot of material that's just kind of hanging loose out here. And if you're not careful, that last bit of saw cut that you haven't done yet will just break off under the weight of this. So once you get towards the end of your saw cut, you'll want to use your offhand to support this piece and keep it from breaking off here at some weird funny angle that might even ruin the workpiece that you're trying to produce here. And if you have a board that's really long and it's too long for you to really support it effectively with your offhand, one way you can support that loose workpiece is with the spring clamp. So just put a spring clamp right over the kerf so it spans the kerf down at this end, and that will help support the extra workpiece that's just kind of hanging off here. And then I don't have to worry about it breaking when I get to the end of the cut, even if it's a really long board. So that's a nice little tip there that you might want to try if you have to do really long rip cuts. There we go. There's my first bit of board. I have to take this thin strip off now. But you know what? Now that I've showed you how to do that with a panel saw, I'm going to go back to doing it the way that I can and would prefer, which is to just rip that piece off using my bandsaw. now I got both my boards ripped free, and you can see that this board here came out pretty clean. I was able to get a pretty long board without any knots in it, except for this little bit right on that edge there. And once I take the rest of the width off of this board, that very well may just, just disappear or be so minute that it's not really anything to worry about. On this other board, I have a couple parts that aren't going to be very useful to me. There's a big knot down here, so I think I'm going to do a cross cut right there. And up here, there's another big knot, so I think I'll just do a cross cut right there. And that should still yield me quite a lot of material that I can use to make this wine caddy out of. So I'm going to mark a perpendicular line referencing from the edge that I planed earlier, the one that's nice and smooth and straight. This square here, which I already had on my bench, isn't quite long enough to go all the way across that. So I just grabbed this Starrett T-square that I have hanging here all the time. It's just easy to grab, so I'll just use that, even though it's way longer than it needs to be. And I'm going to get around all these swirls here and do a horizontal line right behind that. And here's some discoloration up to around that point, so I'm going to go up to about there and draw my cross-cut line right there. And then for this, I'm going to be using a different saw. So this saw is my cross-cut panel saw. It's also a PAX. It's also from Lee Valley, if I recall correctly. And the teeth on here are much, much smaller. And they're filed in such a way that each tooth has a little bit of a different angle to it. Like that and like that. And so this is going to sever the fibers, the cross-grain fibers, a little bit more cleanly than a rip saw would. And of course, because the teeth are smaller, it's going to be less grabby. And it's a shorter panel saw. It's about 22 inches, if I recall correctly. And again, I made my own saw tote for it to match both the fit of my hand and the hang angle that I prefer. All right, so now I'm back at my saw bench, and I have the board secured with a couple of holdfasts, and I have my crosscut saw ready to go. And all the same principles that apply to cutting with a rip panel saw apply here, with one exception. So I still want to sight down the spine of the saw with my dominant eye, which hopefully is the same as your dominant hand. And I still want to drop my forearm and elbow and everything in line with gravity as much as possible. I don't want to be going out that angle or out that angle. Right in line with gravity as much as possible. But one area in which it differs from using a rip cut saw is you want to cut a little bit more horizontal and a little bit less vertical. And that may sound counterintuitive, because when I was telling you that you want to cut with a rip saw more vertical, it was because of tooth engagement. So you can cut faster, with a little bit less effort. In this case, it really has nothing to do with that. If you were to cut more vertically with a cross-cut saw like this, the teeth are more liable to grab these cross-grain fibers on the back side of the board here and just tear them away from the surface. So the cut you're going to get is going to be really rough and splintery and just kind of a mess. So if you were to angle your saw this way more, down here, then those teeth are pulling across instead of straight down away from the face of the board, and you get a little bit cleaner cut that way. So that's the reason that you would cross-cut more like this down here than you would straight up and down like you would with the rip cut. So air on this side, with the rip cut, air on this side, okay? So I use my thumbnail to line up with where I want to start my curve, get it going. Now I need to support this piece with my offhand. And as I get closer to the very end of the cut, I want to go even more horizontal, like this. And with less force. Because more than any other part of the cut, that back corner right there is the one that really wants to just break loose. So sometimes you'll get a big splinter kind of sticking out there because you didn't support with your offhand well enough, or you cut too aggressively and too vertically with the saw. So something to keep in mind, lighten up at the end and go more horizontal at the end, and you'll get a cleaner cut down here. All that said, despite your best efforts, you're going to still end up with some fibers that are kind of loose here at the end, What I like to do is to kind of take a rasp, kind of a medium coarseness of rasp, and just kind of pull those fibers off of the end with the rasp there. Now that's nice and clean and not so splintery. And none of it's going to end up in your fingers, and it's going to be easier to clean up this surface later on with your shooting board plane. You'll be able to get a smoother cut here without those fibers kind of messing it up for you. Let's do the other side. And this is going a little bit more smoothly for me because I actually do use this crosscut saw all the time because I don't have a table saw. And rarely do I even use my track saw to do crosscuts. I just find it's easier to just slap it down here on the saw bench and do my crosscuts with a panel saw by hand. So that's just the way I prefer to do it. And so I'm a little bit better at sawing crosscut than I am with that rip saw that I hardly use anymore because I have a bandsaw. So I'm afraid that's all I'm going to have time for in this video. I have to go pick my kid up from daycare, but it's not such a bad thing. This is a Friday, we're going into the weekend, and these boards are going to sit here over the weekend. And the reason that's not such a bad thing is oftentimes when you cut boards into smaller pieces like that, you release tensions that are present in the wood, and that can cause the boards to move a little bit. They can develop a bow or a twist or whatever. I noticed right away that just from rocking these on my bench that these have a little bit of a twist now that I don't think was there before we started cutting this board up. So this will give the boards a chance to kind of catch up, so to speak, and re-equilibrate with the conditions in my shop. So when I do cut these into smaller pieces and start to mill them, they're more liable to stay flat in the long run. So not such a bad thing. And well, it doesn't seem like we got a whole heck of a lot done. In this video, I just have two boards here instead of one big one. We did cover a lot of ground in terms of technique. We talked about the design that we're going to be working on and what's neat about that, but also we did some board selection. I showed you some edge planing. I showed you a panel gauge and what that's good for. We talked about rip cutting with a panel saw and cross-cutting with a panel saw. A lot of ground was covered here, and hopefully you picked up some tidbits that can help you out in your shop when you're using your hand tools. And in the next video, we're going to be breaking down this stock into smaller parts and starting to mill it flat and to thickness. And again, I'm going to try to do all that by hand. We'll see how it goes. Stick around for that. Hopefully we'll see you in the next video. Take care.